I'd like to welcome everyone on stage, and we'll introduce them. We have Bethany Macri, software engineer at Etsy's data engineering team, John Willis, Jez Humble, Cornelia Davis, and Jean Kim, all moving faster than I can possibly talk. So this feels like a little bit like a game show where we've got a few people here of Jez, John, and Jean, who are the co-authors of the DevOps Handbook. And we've also brought along Bethany and Cornelia to sort of round out the discussion about DevOps, which, as you can see from a bunch of the talks that have been going on, really is the method by which companies are going through these sort of transformations. So without further ado, let's jump in. I'll start with you, Jean. What do you love most about what you do?
These days I consider myself a researcher and a writer. So on a good month, I can spend half the time writing and the other half hanging out with the best in the game. And so, like one of the best parts of the DevOps Handbook journey was being able to spend weeks on the phone with Jez and John and Patrick Dubois, really hang out with people smarter than me. I love this quote, "You're only as smart as the average of the top 5 people you hang out with." So I'm getting smarter every time I hang out with them, and I apologize that you're getting dumber. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. What about you? You're at Pivotal, and I know you work with a lot of enterprises going through cloud adoption and getting them to adjust their mindset to a software-defined world. What is it you love particularly about that role?
Yeah, my favorite part of doing that work with these enterprises is these enterprises have been around for a long time, sometimes over 100 years or more. And they've been doing things in a way that sometimes creates a lot of pain. And my favorite moments are the ones where they start to see the hope, where they start to realize there is, in fact, a different way of doing things, and my life can get better. That's my favorite moment, is those aha moments.
Enterprise IT can be a pretty dismal environment without that ray of light at the end of the tunnel. And what about you, Jez?
I'm really lucky in that I get to not only work with Jean and Nicole Forsgren at DevOps Research, looking at how organizations achieve high performance. I also work for the US federal government at 18F, where we get to actually implement DevOps ideas in partnership with our agency partners in the federal government. So that's been a really interesting experience.
Very important work.
Come on.
Yeah, no, totally. What about you, John? Through your time at Socket Plane and Ops Code and Docker, what is it you love the most?
I was just reminded by Luke, in 2007, I was dragged into this session thinking I'll just sit in the back of the room, and there was a young, pimply-faced kid named Luke Canese talking about Puppet. And it really started my journey in DevOps. And I think just being an evangelist over the years, meeting people early and then having them come back a few years later and saying, that stuff you talked about, it really worked. So just being an evangelist and continuing this.
I think that's been one of the great things with the State DevOps report, seeing the evolution over the years of people adopting these things.
Been fun, yes.
And Bethany, you're in the data engineering group at Etsy?
Yes, so I'm on the storage team. Currently, there are only 3 ICs on the team, and by far and away, my favorite part of the job is just figuring out what makes a team perform the best together. That's been more satisfying to me than solving any technical problem that we've been able to solve. So figuring out, what makes each individual work the best, and then together as a group, what makes us perform the best.
I think it's interesting how all of these things end up being underpinned by people, essentially. It's really not about the technology. So let's go to our alliterative authors again. So Jean, what was the thing you loved the most about writing? What did you learn the most about writing the book?
I say with a certain sense of shame that there's a certain feeling you get like when you ship a book that takes over 5.5 years to deliver. It's a very long time. And I still get screenshots of PowerPoints that we gave back in 2011 saying DevOps is coming, the DevOps Handbook is coming next year. Right? Someone even tweeted at me saying George R.R. Martin is going to come out with his next Game of Thrones book before the DevOps Handbook is here. But it's finally here. It came out 2 weeks ago. In fact, we'll be giving out copies of the DevOps Handbook at noon. And so we'll be signing those books if you want. Right? You can take them unsigned if you wish it that way. But for me, I think one of the reason why the book took so long is that we really wanted a lot of case studies in this. So there's 48 case studies in the book, and I think that's really important for adult learners because, I think we tend to learn less by theory and people saying, here's what you should do. I think we learn better when we can actually hear people go through their experience, say, here's a business problem we were trying to solve, here's what we did, here's what we expected to happen, this was what actually happened, and here's what we learned. So, to have 48 organizations describe portions of the DevOps journey, I think was extremely rewarding for me, and I'm just really proud of the way the book came out.
I think you're probably asking for trouble co-authoring with a continuous process with the continuous delivery or the Jez. What about you with writing the book? What did you learn about?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because, for someone who bangs on about continuous delivery a lot, there is nothing more big batch than writing a book. It's an extremely waterfall process. But it was a lot of fun along the way, both working with my co-authors and working with other people in the industry and finding out what people have been up to. And I think that's the most interesting thing of the whole thing, really, is seeing other people try these things, finding out what they learn, trying to broadcast that to people. I once ran a conference, and one of our principles, which we actually stole from QCon, was called Information Robin Hood. And the idea is, there's all these companies that talk about how great they are. Being able to actually get the how it works out of them and broadcast to other people so they can try those ideas for themselves, that I think is the cool thing about this.
I think this has been one of the great things of the DevOps movement, people being encouraged to actually share not just their achievements, but just how bad things were in the first place. What about you, John?
Well, going with the history theme here, in 2010, I met another young, good-looking man. His name happened to be Gene Kim. And we started this kind of journey of, he was writing the Phoenix Project, and then this idea of creating a prescriptive guide to the novel, the Phoenix Project being a novel. We knew early on, he knew that early on there had to be some prescriptive add-on. And I think the book is symbolic of the journey. I think had we completed it in 2012, 2013, it would have been the wrong book. The reason I think this book is amazing, with Jez coming in and with all his wealth of information, and now is the right time to tell a story about what we've learned over the last 5 or 6 years. So I think the timing, even though it took a really long time, I don't think it could have worked out any better than to happen now, to be honest with you.
Bethany's project that she shepherded for many years, Morg, is actually one of the case studies in the book, which I'm just so delighted by.
No, it's great. And I think you all mentioned how one of the great things about this book is it's not theoretical, it's like real-world case studies. So I'd sort of start with Bethany, we've got a few Etsy case studies. Is there anything from the book or sort of experiences from your own career that you'd like to sort of chat about briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. So I co-authored a project called Morg, which is a web application that is a post-mortem tracker. It's very simple. All it does is kind of help memorialize a post-mortem. If you're not familiar, I assume everyone's familiar with what a postmortem is, but it's conducted after an event like a site outage. It's like a retrospective. And Morg was really the result of me researching and experiencing the postmortem process at Etsy. And what I found was that the obsessive focus on blamelessness at Etsy during postmortems really enabled the kind of candor that I believe allows systems to become better. And contrary to what it might seem like, blamelessness does not mean a lack of responsibility, and it absolutely does not mean that everyone agrees. I think the kind of honesty it enables when fear is removed from the equation, when you're not afraid of being blamed, the kind of candid disagreements that can happen ultimately make better software.
Bethany, I remember when you gave your talk at DevOps Days New York, you said one of the things that you're actually thinking about for Morg was actually to make it illegal to actually use the words would have or could have in the narrative.
Yes.
Did that actually make it in?
There are no shoulds allowed in Morg. There are no shoulds, and we also discourage the use of why, because that can seem very pointed. So we can rather encourage what or how questions.
That's awesome. Coming back, John, was there anything from the book that you found particularly interesting?
I'm the old guy. Like 35 years I've been doing this stuff, and actually started out in the mainframe. So my favorite story in the book is Cornelia, who is, I think, in this room somewhere, and she's speaking over the next couple of days, of a story of, and I apologize if I summarize it wrong, Courtney, but the story was that at Nordstrom, every year they would argue over this mainframe COBOL app, and it had like really bad lead times. And at the beginning, I see people smiling, right? Like, you all have this. Let's get rid of it. Oh, it's horrible. How do we do it? Next year, same argument over and over. And finally, what Courtney did was take a core principle of kind of DevOps and culture and did a value stream mapping of this application. And they found out it really kind of had nothing to do with COBOL, had nothing to do with the mainframe. It was a manual handoff process that caused the long lead times. They actually fixed it during the value stream map process. Done. And I think that story to me says there is no such thing as bimodal IT, right? That it's value stream, it's what, you know, that's what DevOps is all about. It's not about this is an old legacy, leave it alone, and this is new. Face it, it's about the value stream, it's about lean principles, which are heavily discussed in the book.
I know, Jez, you've had some thoughts around bimodal IT, you know?
Oh, no, I think it's great.
I think, okay. What about the book?
Yeah, we're going to talk about this in a bit, I think, but like...
Said that. I've always been a fan of bimodal IT.
I mean, we go from like this one-size-fits-all solution to now we have a two-sizes-fits-all solution. And I think one of the core principles of DevOps is really problem solving and how do we get better. And the idea that there's, you know, and I'm kind of deliberately, you know, using a bit of a straw man, but this idea that there's one domain where we can use all these new ideas and this one domain where we really can't and we should just kind of leave it alone somewhat. I find that extremely problematic. I mean, one of the stories from my previous book that I like most was about Australia's largest insurance company and how they built automated test suites for their mainframe systems. And there's a video of them running these automated test suites, creating thousands of policies in a few seconds and running batch jobs as part of the automated tests. The idea that you can't apply these ideas and principles to legacy systems, to complex distributed systems, it is nonsense. These ideas apply everywhere.
I think we've seen that be one of the pervasive myths around DevOps, that it wasn't applicable to legacy systems, when in many ways that was where some of the most significant gains could actually be found. What about you, Cornelia? In your experience, any particularly interesting case studies or stuff from the book?
Yeah, so one of my favorite examples was a very large retail, US-based retailer that we were working with. And the first time I met with them was almost 2 years ago in January. And initially, we just went in to kind of get the lay of the land, see what their IT systems were like and what their developer processes were like and operations processes. And what we found was that they had built up a platform. They called it a platform, but it was really just a Java server farm. And what it did was it essentially allowed you to deploy applications across a whole bunch of different machines. And when I spoke with the people who had created the Java server farm, they were very proud of it. And from an operations perspective, it actually gave them some benefits because there was some resilience and all that stuff built into the technology. But we all know that DevOps is not only about technology. So when it came time for me to talk to the developers, they all hated it. Because the way that it had been set up was it really ended up constraining them so much. It really shackled them. They didn't have choice. They didn't have opportunities to make the right decisions for their applications. For example, when it came time to do database stuff, they had no access to the database whatsoever. They handed over their schema. They got back jar files. And it was a very long and laborious process, even to add a field to their own system.
That's because you can never trust developers.
That's right. You can't trust developers. That was exactly the mood. It's good point, Gene. That was exactly the mood. And so I talked earlier about kind of that drudgery. It's a company that the employees loved the company, but they didn't love their jobs. They didn't love what they did on a day-to-day basis. And so this was, like I said, about 2 years ago in January. By August, we had helped them stand up kind of an alternative technology infrastructure, you know, in a sort of proof of concept setting. But again, technology is not the only thing. So in addition to that, we started running workshops. But we did a couple of things in those workshops. It wasn't about teaching the technology. Sure, we had to do that too. But we did a couple of things. Number one, we insisted that anytime we ran a workshop, that both development and operations teams were involved. If they didn't register, we didn't run the workshop. So they had to be there to get that shared experience. And then we did devious things like we let lunch run long. So instead of having a half-hour lunch, working lunch, where we're all in front of our computers, we had 2-hour lunches. So the people who used to point fingers at each other started to get to know each other as individuals. Well, we ran about 20 of those workshops between August and December of last year. And another important thing that happens during those workshops is we start to find the people who are really enthusiastic about it. We find the internal champions. Well, like I said, we ran about 20 of those workshops from August to December. This year, in 2016, we've run exactly this many, 0. But those champions have run about 100 of them. And now there's about 1,000 developers who are loving their jobs because they're given choice, they've been able to make, and they're working together with the operations teams, sometimes have taken operations on themselves. So it was a real cultural transformation.
That's
really
amazing.
Fantastic.
I'm constantly distressed but no longer surprised at the number of times we go on site and it's the first time various teams have actually ever been in the same room together.
Yep.
So Jean, I know this might be like choosing between children, but which of the case studies was actually your favorite?
I was thinking about that for a long time. I think my favorite one, I mean, which seems maybe unexpected because, I don't like the unicorn stories so much about the Googles, Amazons, Facebooks, but I love the horse stories, right? Large, complex organizations. I love the Mike Wittig case study that he gave. I love that. But, I think the case study I love the most is the one about Google. And the reason is that, I got a chance to talk to so many people from Google, friends there, and I always asked, where did this amazing automated testing culture come from? And almost all of them to a T said, I don't know, it was sort of here when I started. And so I asked Jez, and he goes, oh, you should talk to Mike Bland, right? He and his mates did that back in 2005. And so I ended up talking with him, and he told this amazing story about how Google, in 2005, to push onto Google.com was actually a very dangerous thing to do. He called it the dumping ground where all the developers put their untested code, right? And it would cause, site out, rarely site outages, but I mean, it would cause, incorrect searches, errors and so forth. And there was a phrase that he used, fear became the mind killer. New employees were afraid to deploy because they didn't understand the system at all. Experienced employees were afraid to deploy because they understood the system all too well, right? Which I thought was just lovely. And so basically he told the story about where the Google Web Services team essentially put this hard line in the sand that you can no longer deploy code onto Google.com until you have automated testing, right? And then so, it sounds like a technology transformation, but I mean, it really is a cultural one. It's like, hey, look, I don't care how busy you are, but if you want your site to run, your new code to run, you have to have automated testing. And the next part of the journey was even more fantastic, where essentially they became the exemplar of technical practices inside of Google, and thus began a three-year journey to spread it across the rest of the Google enterprise. So that's 10,000 plus engineers. And they use many techniques, guerrilla techniques, top down. But I think the most famous of it was called TOTT, testing on the toilet, right? Where essentially they put flyers in every bathroom stall, right? Educating them on here's what JUnit testing is, and here's how you can learn more. And if you want help, we're here for you, right? And that was just how they elevated Google to a point where they're doing 5,500 code commits per day. They have billions of files in one code repo. And I love that story because it turns out not even Google was always Google. They were a horse like the rest of us. Yeah. And you were you saw parts of that, right?
Well, I arrived in America as a rather disoriented Australian, and first time I go into a Google bathroom, it's not only a ridiculous Japanese toilet with heaters and water jets and various things, but then I shut the door and it's trying to explain Java unit testing to me. I'm like, what have I actually done here? It was sort of ridiculous, actually. So one of the things we were going to talk about was, whether there's any areas where DevOps isn't actually applicable, and I think we sort of touched on that a bit with the mainframe thing. But I think it's become clear, at least the positions of everyone on the panel, is that these are general practices and processes around systems thinking and improvement that are actually applicable anywhere. Are there any other particularly surprising areas people have seen success in?
Yeah, I mean, so the federal government is an enterprise that's been going since about 1789, and obviously we haven't been using computers for that long. But I think that's been really interesting for me, and also one of the case studies in the book as well. To take a service, a system live in the federal government, there's over 4,000 pages worth of policy and law and compliance documentation that you have to follow in order to do that. That process typically takes 8 to 14 months. There's over 100 controls that you have to implement even for a low-impact federal government system. So that's a situation where you would expect it to be quite hard to do DevOps, and indeed it is, but there's a team within 18F building a platform called CloudGov, which is a platform as a service based on Cloud Foundry. And the idea behind it is, well, we can take care of most of that at the platform layer and at the infrastructure layer. And by doing that, all you have to take care of is the residual controls that aren't taken care of below that. And so that, I think, has been a really fascinating idea, that actually we can limit the scope of what you have to do as an engineer, as an application developer, to just the small bit that isn't taken care of at the lower levels of the system. And that's currently going through the ATO process now. ATO, Authority to Operate, is going through that process of documenting and implementing and testing all those different controls. And once that's in place, we're hopeful it'll be much, much quicker to get software developed. And that is built using modern DevOps principles, infrastructure as a service, continuous integration. It's all open source. It's on GitHub. Everything that 18F builds pretty much is public domain, open source. We believe, it's your money, so you should get that source code. And so if that's successful, which I think it will be, that'll be a huge sea change, and it just shows that you can apply these principles anywhere.
Would you mind sharing, it's been fun watching you go through this journey, and now that you're one of 6 platform people supporting 150 developers, you feel differently about developers these days.
Yeah.
Don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I
I think we have developers here, if you hadn't realized.
Some of my best friends.
Who's a developer in the audience? Who are developers? Okay, who works in IT operations? Okay, that's an overwhelming majority of my people. Well, because I started off as a kind of person who did everything in a startup, and then I became a developer, and now I'm back to being an IT operations person after 13 years of mainly doing development, and it's amazing how quickly I dropped back into that, man. And I was, when you start getting pages and you start getting pinged in instant response, it's amazing to me how quickly I drop back into being that developers. Yeah.
Some of my best friends are developers. I love developers. Fine people.
So Nigel, there's Gene and I and a couple people working on this thing called the DevOps Enterprise Summit. This is 3rd year. I happen to be working with this investment bank that got acquired about a year and a half ago, and KeyBank was the acquirer. And we invited these people from KeyBank to last year's DevOps Enterprise Summit. DevOps was really kind of new, and they didn't really understand it. They went to that summit. They were so impressed. I ran into these guys recently. They're actually going to speak in this year. They went, the idea of cell phones in China, right? You can skip right over. You don't have to build landline infrastructure. Literally, this is a cell phone in China story, because they're actually running Chaos Monkey in production on a production banking application. So they went from really knowing nothing about DevOps to using automation tools like Puppet and coming all the way to now they're actually running kind of anti-fragile infrastructure in a production bank system.
That's amazing. One of the things before we get to the end, I know, Bethany, you talked in our earlier conversations about how the support rotation worked at Etsy and how you thought that had a really big impact on a relatively large and complex organization.
Yeah, I think that the pillars of DevOps are completely separate, and I have strong opinions on this. From any specific tooling, from microservices, from any configuration management that you use in particular. I mean, at Etsy, we're a monolith. We run our own hardware and our own data centers, and I think we're a pretty good example of functional DevOps. So I think the pillars are really empathy and collaboration, and what we've done at Etsy to put structure to that is we have rotations. So engineers can do rotations on other engineering teams, engineers can do rotations on the legal team, the trust and safety team, and we are all at the organization required to do rotations on the customer support team. So especially during times of the year, as an e-commerce site, that would be around the holidays, when we have a really high volume of emails coming in, this becomes really important to us. And what's happened as a result of that is that engineers have done rotations, support rotations, and have then made tooling to facilitate answering these emails, and have ended up helping the customer support team. So and then it ultimately helps our customers because they get a response faster. So that's, I think, a really great example of how collaboration and empathy can have this tangible effect.
And just to row back on what I said earlier, this is exactly the experience we're having at 18F. The people building the CloudGov platform, it's developers and operations people working together to build and operate the platform. And there's really no distinction between the roles. That, you know, you might be doing development stuff on the platform, you might be operating it within the same hour. That you really need to combine those roles.
That's amazing. I know we've only got a few minutes left, but Cornelia, you came up with some really interesting stuff around Ford in our earlier conversations that I'd love to hear about.
Yeah, so Ford is a very interesting case from my perspective. So I was there earlier this year, and it's really interesting because of the downturn in the automotive industry. When you go to Dearborn, you can actually still feel that. You can feel Ford did a tremendous job. They were able to weather that storm by really becoming very cost conscious and being very disciplined and very deliberate. And in the process became pretty risk adverse. And you can actually feel that. When you're in Dearborn, you can feel that, not just on campus, but just anywhere in the town. You can just really feel that. And so one of the interesting things, of course, now, though, is that the automotive industry is being hugely disrupted. It's a whole transportation industry. So Ford will say, we're no longer an automotive company, we're a transportation company. So recognizing that people aren't buying cars the way that they used to. They're sharing cars, they're using Uber, those types of things. And so they know that they need to make a change. And in the time that I've spent there on campus, it's interesting because we see it in many different companies. Sometimes it comes from a groundswell. Sometimes it comes from the grassroots, and the DevOps movement comes that way. And sometimes it comes from above. And at Ford, it's actually coming more from the executives, this recognition that they need to change everything because everything around them is changing. But there's then a process of getting it to filter down to the boots on the ground. And so I had, for example, one experience where I was meeting with a group of individuals, and we were talking about a number of things, but one of those things was capacity planning. So capacity planning arguably changes a great deal when we move into kind of a DevOps world. It isn't all done ahead of time. It's done more collaboratively and so on. And when I asked them who's responsible for it, the individual in the room actually brought up her laptop, went to their IT manual. They have everything laid out down to the finest level of detail, back to you can't trust anyone. Everything's been documented. And she looked it up and said, yep, right here it says that my group is responsible for capacity planning. So it's that fear, that risk aversion that needs to now be enabled. And it needs to come from the executive team who's on board, but they now have to give the folks permission and the ability to take risks and change the way that they're doing things.
That's awesome. So with that, I think we've just about sort of hit the end of the time we have for the panel. When are we doing the book signings, Jane?
We're doing the book signing at noon in the expo area. Go to the IT Revolution booth, and again, Jez, John, and I will be signing books only if you want, right? And we'll be giving away DevOps handbooks, and I think also the Phoenix projects as well.
And we'll all be around at the conference over the next few days and come up and have a chat. Thank you, everyone.